I'm Bob Noone. I'm the editor of the journal Family Systems, published by the Bowen Center in Washington. And as many of you know, this current issue is focused on probably the most important problems that our species faces at the present time in terms of our impact on the planet and what can be done about it. The issue grew out of the thinking that was behind a conference a couple of years ago on climate change. And with me today is Dr. Daniel Papero, who's on the faculty at the Bowen Center and is the author of one of the papers, the paper being the Rory Bowen's contribution to the study of complex human systems. So I thought this would be a interesting discussion to have related to how Bowen theory may make a contribution to this enormous problem that we're faced with. So Dan, I don't know where you'd like to begin with all of this. There were a number of aspects of the article that struck me, and I think it's an important paper, and I'd like to see it get out there. One of them, I think you listed 9 ideas that you thought Bowen theory could contribute to approaching this problem. But I'll let you begin and see what were your thoughts today related to this issue and Bowen theory.
First of all, I think it's a good issue, not because my paper's in it, but because the other papers are excellent in it. The paper by John Gowdy, for example, is, I think, first class, as is, well, they're all, I don't mean to single any of them out. I think they're all excellent and on this. I was approached by Victoria Harrison about a year before the conference if I would write something or develop a presentation for the conference. And I had been thinking for just a long time about the contribution Bowen theory makes to the study of the human beyond simply the family. In other words, extending family concepts into some of these other areas. And I've just spent, I guess, honestly, decades thinking about it, really. And it was a chance to try to pull some of these ideas together and put them into some kind of form. And so I came up with what I thought were 9 significant contributions that Bowen's thinking made to the study of complex human systems. I don't have all 9 in front of me right now, but you'll see my aging brain struggle to remember them all.
Well, but I got them, Dan, so go ahead.
I mean, one of the ones that I thought was very important that I still think doesn't get recognized for how important it is this idea of linking changes in behavior to levels or degrees or strengths of what Bowen calls anxiety, which is, as you know, a bigger concept than psychiatric diagnosis of anxiety. It really is the response of the organism, the individual, to menace, to perceived threat, which includes the activation of the stress response, the HPA axis, alongside the sympathetic nervous system, which is more of the anxious anxiety definition within DSM. And it just seems to be such an important idea that simply by working to regulate the intensity of anxiety and decrease it, one begins to find ways to work through problems. What seems to happen out in the world is that the anxiety gets ramped up and it keeps being fostered and keeps being fostered. And to try to convey this idea that the level of anxiety is important, it's not something that the individual is helpless about. There are things that people can do to regulate anxiety. And then when one is regulating anxiety, he or she begins to influence this phenomenon called emotion contagion and emotion convergence, which is the process by which more and more people get pulled into these very stirred up and ultimately polarized positions. And so I thought that was important.
Yeah, I think it's important in terms of recognizing, I think both those who are in favor of trying to do something about the impact of the human on the planet and its climate, and those who deny it, both can be stirred up to respond with a good deal of anxiety. And as you were indicating, this increased anxiety decreases the capacity to address complex problems. One of the other items you mentioned had to do with Bowen's introduction of the thinking about two basic guidance systems, which touches on what you were describing with anxiety, and how being aware of that in itself, I think, is helpful in trying to deal with this enormous problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the central components of the concept of differentiation of self. As you know, this idea of two guidance systems, an emotional system and what Bowen called an intellectual system. And I have been out there, and as you have in the literature, and this is now a fairly well accepted idea. It's not necessarily called an emotional system and an intellectual system. The researcher Amy Arnsten at Yale talks about reflexive versus reflective governance of the organism. The reflexive being the automatic, which would be, as I would think about it, very similar, if not synonymous, with what Bowen's calling the emotional system. And then the reflective system would be very similar to what Bowen's calling the intellectual system. And just an awareness that there are two things that are at play here, and the potential of one to override the other. That is the reflexive, the oldest one from an evolutionary point of view, the one that's got the longest track record in guiding organisms, can overwhelm this new addition from an evolutionary point of view. And that it is possible for the human, at least at times, to know the difference inside of self between what these two systems are like, and then use that, as Arnsten calls it, reflective system to help regulate the emotional system, which is part of the business of regulating anxiety. It's not the only piece of it, but that's part of it. And again, you know, I don't know, it may just be my peculiarity, but it seems to me that it's important to spell these things out. I think people don't make a distinction between feeling, first of all, and that which is more automatic and deeper, which Bowen called emotion. Nor do they think that there is a choice that they can have about how they respond to something. And certainly in the Western world, there's been, over the last 75 years or so, a sort of a favoring of the feeling side of it, that the feeling thing should be let loose and that will solve everything. And in fact, it appears as though exactly the opposite has happened. The more you let the feeling things run wild, the more behavior tends to go off the rails in one way or another. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about.
Well, again, I think the emotional system, as you said, which represents pretty much automatic behavior, sort of underlies what's happened in terms of the human impact. It's not people can begin to see the human as flawed, which of course we are, but I mean as in a negative light, or see those who are contributing to the problem as having a selfish point of view. And so much of it is just automatic and part of human nature. But as you said, the human has this capacity to be able to look at that. And then I think you have to take that into account without getting into good guys and bad guys, you know, that are going to either doom us as a species or save us as a species. It's going to require some thoughtful use of the intellectual system, I think, to deal with this.
I do too. And the point you make is such an important one. And it's so hard to stay out of the good guys and bad guys thing. I mean, I struggle with it. I've spent decades thinking about it and thinking what a problem it is and how easy it is to slip into it. You know, the people who think the way I think are the good guys, and the ones who don't think the way I think are the bad guys. And therefore, we good guys have to fight the bad guys. And now we're in a polarization that where we're not talking to one another, and we're driving a kind of a psychotic perceptual field in which we're interpreting and responding to the other. So the human dilemma writ large creates the polarizations in a certain sense that we see in our world today.
Yeah, and it's the polarizations that make it difficult to really approach these complex problems in any kind of cooperative, large-scale manner.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think another one of the pieces you put in there had to do with systems thinking, which of course is central to Bowen theory. And of course, central systems thinking was alive and well and is alive and well in many other disciplines and other aspects of looking at behavior. But Bowen really had a unique way of looking at it, and just thought it was central to an understanding of human behavior, which still isn't quite apparent in terms of what's needed in terms of thinking related to this large scale problem that we have.
Yeah, I think that's right. You're right. Systems thinking has become more prevalent in the world from the point that Bowen started now almost 70 years ago. But it still, I don't think, is really getting traction in the arenas that it needs to get traction, in other words, to begin to address these very complex problems that we have. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't claim to understand or know what's going on in all these circles where people are working on things, but it sure doesn't seem like it's getting there in a significant way around some of these major problems.
I know I can get kind of pessimistic about the direction that this problem is going in, because the scale is so large and the change required is going to be so profound. And yet there is evidence of some change taking place. But it's easy to feel hopeless. And I think another one of the ideas you put into the paper had to do with the role of the family in society, and to look at a smaller scale, not necessarily looking at the population as a whole and the planet as a whole, but beginning to look at kind of the lower levels emotional systems operating in the family and how that impacts society, and vice versa.
Yeah, I've been influenced a lot over the years by your work and by the work of others, and I began to think about the family as an evolutionary unit, one that is more basic than larger social units, actually, and that larger social units actually build upon the organizational structure of the family. And it occurred to me that there are things people can do to improve their own functioning within their family system. And as one works to improve his or her own functioning, it influences the functioning of the family unit, I believe, toward greater effective and efficiency of functioning. When you get a family unit functioning more efficiently, it exerts a pressure on its surrounding context. Other family units, groups, communities of which it's a part, to function up. It becomes, in a certain sense, a leadership unit within the larger structure when it's functioning well. And it seemed to me that this represented one road that anybody could work on that could contribute to an effort to begin to create the kind of effectiveness of functioning that's going to be required if we're going to try to address some of these very challenging problems that face us. It takes it out of this big realm of, well, I can't do anything about what they're doing in Washington, or I don't know what to do about the situation in the Ukraine, or the fact that the glaciers are melting in Antarctica. But it brings it close to home, and there's something one can do. You can do something in your own home, in your own neighborhood, in your own community, and in doing so, you are making a bet, if you will, a bet with some substance to it, that you're going to produce a future outcome that will be helpful in some way.
Yeah, you mentioned being able to have some influence as an individual within your family, and then the family has influence on its surrounding environment. And I was thinking of some of your thinking and presentations related to the phenomenon of helplessness, the feeling of helplessness, and when individuals can have some sense of control in their lives and what they're doing, it helps them to move beyond that sense of helplessness, which I think a lot of people get caught up in with this environmental problem.
Yeah. Well, in his earliest research, that's one of the things Bowen identified, that the families that he was observing in his research study, the Family Research Project at the NIMH, viewed themselves as helpless to address the challenges they faced, and that the system, the family system, functioned differently when someone in that family would begin to identify a problem to work on and begin to work on it, begin to problem solve. He actually talks about the triggering of problem solving, and there's research evidence now that's accrued to back up the observation that many people have had for a long time, that when someone begins to work on problem solving, anxiety goes down. And in the intervening years since Bowen began to propose this, there's a whole scientific basis that's come underneath it to support how that works literally within the human brain. The brain is extraordinarily complex and things are being discovered all the time, but some of these basic processes are now, I think, fairly well understood. And it makes all the sense in the world about how one works on the helplessness, which has to do with engaging a challenge, working on it, putting oneself in the face of discomfort to work on something, which in effect leads to a kind of immunization. The more somebody does that, the more confident they become at it, and then they begin to transfer this ability into other situations, which is, again, a piece of the escalation that I think can come out of someone working on self in a family. When a family does better, it handles challenges within the community better. When it handles challenges within the community better, the community has a potential to function up, and so on, all the way up the line.
Yeah, it's certainly important to have that kind of sense of can-do, of being able to impact one's environment to some degree. I know you referred to some of the animal studies by Ian Cousins and Thomas Seeley in terms of the impact that individuals or a small group can have on the larger social group, which is just interesting in terms of they're both good systems thinkers, I think, in terms of how the smaller scale behavior can influence the larger group.
Yeah, and that's an idea that's been around for 20 years. It's been around longer than that, but it got a lot of focus maybe 20 years ago with the Santa Fe Institute and all that business, that a small change sustained can make a big change. But there is research out there that's really suggesting what the small changes might be that could make a big change. And in part of the paper, Bowen talks about, in his work on societal processes, he talks about using the ideas from the best thinkers. And it seems to me it's not that there's an absence of ideas about how you work on this. It's that people don't know them, can't find a way, and can't get started on them. And I think Ian Cousins' work, as you know, he's now at Max Planck, the head of their collective behavior research program, is one of the brilliant people looking at this, about how small changes of individuals within the group leads them actually to become leaders without ever having to say, I'm the leader. They begin to influence the direction of the group. And now we've seen that happen in a way that has been regressive, but the same thing happens progressively as well. It's the regressive stuff can go very fast because it's accompanied by high levels of anxiety. The progressive stuff is slower, I think, because it has to be maintained in the face of this anxiety and ultimately helping to bring it down while producing more effective, competent management of challenge. I've just been working on a talk I'm going to do for the New England group on managing oneself in an emotional field, and I've been thinking a lot about there's something important about, in regression, the movement is led by the most intense people, the extremes, if you will, on each side of the polarization. And there's something about that intensity that rivets people to the intensity. And one of the important challenges in trying to figure out how to live and work through a polarization is to disengage from the fringes and focus more on contact with what Cousin calls the middle. Those that are uncommitted, those that are laying low, those that are, in other words, you're working to have contact with the middle part of the polarization, not the extremes. And that if that can be done, there is a way through the polarization which dissolves the polarization from the inside out, if you will, if you can imagine that somehow. It's just really interesting to think about how that might be worked on.
Well, it is
Anyway.
interesting. It is interesting when you think about the extremes in our society right now and how much of it gets generated by fear.
Yeah.
And then the fear adds to the polarization, and polarization adds to the fear. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the value of having a hopeful perspective on what the human can do. Again, that kind of can-do attitude. I mean, there's nothing about the human that would preclude being able to grapple with this problem and get it under control in this next century. But the long-term thinking and that kind of hopefulness is something that gets really kind of underplayed when you begin to think about problems like this. But it's certainly, as fearfulness is contagious, so is hopefulness, but not to the same degree.
Yep. Good functioning is just as attractive as regressive functioning. It just doesn't work as fast. It's more subtle somehow. I can't put my finger on it. In the last month, I've had the good fortune to fall heir to 8 boxes of correspondence that were generated by my maternal aunt, who was in the first group of women naval officers brought in World War II, and subsequently became the commander in charge of all the women in naval aviation in the Pacific theater in World War II. And I've been reading through her letters, and it's you catch this. On the one hand, they're dealing with these horrible things. The ships are coming back, the men are mangled, people go off and don't come back, and yet there's this energy. They're doing something that's important to them. There's a purpose to what they're doing, and the purpose has a value to it that is emotional. It is emotional, but it is an energy that propels them. And it's just really interesting to think about what that's about, what mindset has to do with how people behave, and what mindset among a group of people has to do with their capacity to engage and to function in the face of great challenge.
Well, that is, yeah. And again, as you said, that kind of mindset can be attractive to people if they have a sense that they can contribute in a meaningful way to make progress or whatever we're up against.
Yeah.
I know you. Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Well, I was thinking, in terms of the end of your article, I like the way that you put in three kind of basic aspects of what Bowen theory can contribute, which really sort of covers what you were describing. But one had to do with the decrease in the denial of reality-based problems, and then how do you go about dealing with that decrease in the denial that exists. A second one had to do with managing anxiety and fearfulness in order to begin to address these complex problems. And then to promote complex thinking and complex actions. Because again, as you were saying, the fearfulness can be automatic, but if to take on these complex problems, it requires complex action over a period of time. And how do you sustain that? That becomes so important. But I think Bowen theory really does address these three things, as you pointed out.
I think it does too. I've been struck, as I think many people have been, by the world we live in today, where there seems to be, among many sides of these polarizations, a kind of a psychotic perception of the world. It's lost contact with any kind of objectively definable reality. And then how do you pull back from that? How do you begin to bring objective knowledge back into the picture? And then people will say, well, you can never be 100% objective. Well, that's true, but you don't have to be 99% psychotic either. Can you begin to reel this in a little bit more, and I don't know. I think that's possible. I think partly as anxiety comes down, it is more possible for people to begin to be more objective about what they're up against and what has to happen to get something accomplished, and what they're going to have to work on in order to do that, as opposed to these almost psychotic driven perceptions, which are focused on fantasies about all-knowing, all-powerful leaders and simple actions that are going to solve every problem, and these sorts of things that lead to the vast human history of genocide and all the rest of it, driven by a loss of objectivity, really, about the nature of life, about the problems being faced, and about what has to happen.
Well, I think one aspect of Bowen's genius had to do with recognizing the foundation of one's subjectivity in the family, and can you work? There's the potential to work on self in the family, becoming knowledgeable about the family and being a part of it. That automatically leads to having more capacity to be objective. He talked about walking around the grounds at Menninger's, and then when he'd get away, he could be more objective about the workplace. And then somehow he picked up on the idea of family would be the most important arena to work on self, and how much that can influence one's thinking in all spheres related to trying to get a less subjective view on the world around us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that was his discovery, and he laid it out in a way that makes it accessible to people.
Well, it won't be likely that a large-scale movement towards working on self and family is going to take place, but it doesn't take a lot.
Well, that's the point. What's the tipping point? If people like Cousins are right, if people who are looking at some of these collective processes are right, it doesn't take a whole bunch to make something happen. It just takes a few who are really clear and determined on their direction that somehow begin to influence everyone else. Is that really the way it works? Well, I tend to think science is important. That's what science is suggesting. And I'd say, let's give it a try. What's there to lose?
Dan, I think your article is one of those steps in that direction in terms of thinking about how individuals can begin to contribute to make a difference. But it always starts with self. Not always. There are people who don't spend a lot of time thinking about self who make a difference, I think. But it's certainly a way that people can go in. So anything else you wanted to put in today, Dan?
That's more than I thought I had available.
Well, you got a lot more, and people will have to read your paper in order to do that. So,
well, I hope that paper will get read. I hope the others do too. I'd like to see some of this get a little more discussion in the world. Not that I'd like to see my ideas validated. I'd just like to see people begin to grapple with these things.
I would too. I think this issue of the journal is an important issue, and as you mentioned, not just your paper, but the other papers by Victoria and Dr. John Gowdy and Stephanie Ferrara are all very conducive to thinking about moving in the direction to solve this big problem we have.
I just think it's in our own quiet little way, I think this is a very, very important set of papers for the world in some ways, and that's maybe grandiose on my part, but probably is grandiose, but nonetheless, I think that's what it is.
Well, it's positive. I think that's what's important. It's not what's important, but it is important.
It is important. Yeah.
Well, thanks for taking the time today, Dan. I appreciate it.
It was fun. Yep. Okay. Take care, Bob.
Bye now.
Bye.